Ah, coffee. It was first introduced to Hawaii in the year 1825 from Brazil and actually planted here on the island of Oahu before later taking hold on the Big Island in the popular region of Kona. In 1892, a Guatemalan variety was introduced and quickly became the coffee farmer's preferred bean. Most of the coffee produced in Hawaii today comes from this bean. Large-scale coffee production now occurs in 11 different regions on 5 of the 8 Hawaiian islands, with many small farms scattered throughout. However, the coffee that I harvest is wild, feral. Having long ago escaped the confines of these small valley farms, it now grows free high above the valleys and the mountains of Oahu. I don't know if it originates from the beans of Brazil or the beans of Guatemala. All I do know is that it's good. The red cherries are the preferred cherries, so sorting is considered an essential part of the process. Premium coffee sold around the world typically comes from red cherry beans. However, at the levels I like to roast, Vienna and light French, I haven't really noticed much of a flavor difference between them. If I was roasting at a lighter level such as City, then there would probably be an earthier taste with the greener beans. Yet in the interest of science, I still separate them. There may in fact be some variation in caffeine content, but I have yet to determine this for certain. I'm also checking for any noticeable insect damage. Since wild coffee is not treated with any insecticides, it's vulnerable to invasive species. There will be other opportunities to identify any damaged fruit later on in the process. The next stage in the process is depulping, removing the skins from the coffee fruit. Large-scale coffee producers have a special machine for doing this, but I do it the old-fashioned way. When the coffee fruit emerges from the skin, it's covered by a very slippery layer called the mucilage. These skin fruits tend to hop all over the room, so having a bowl and a deep sink really helps to contain them. When the bowl is full of slimy fruit, I will add clean water until it reaches an inch or two above the surface and let them soak for 24 to 36 hours. This allows the sugar in the mucilage layer to ferment and break down, which helps remove it for further processing. I keep a small bowl of water handy to rinse as the skins tend to dye my fingertips a nasty nicotine brown, which seems to resist all manner of soap and scrubbing. I also like to rinse away any worms or bugs that might have been living inside the skin layer, but have not gotten through to the defenses of the fruit. It usually takes me about an hour to depulp a bowl of cherries of this size. After I reach the capacity of my first bowl and add the water, there's another opportunity to sort out any defective fruits. You can see that there are some floaties hovering around the surface of the water. This is due to air having gotten through to the next layer, usually as a result of irregular fruit growth or insect invasion. So it's easy to simply skim along the surface and remove them. These would be considered inferior to premium grade coffee, although they might still be viable. I will keep them separated from the others, but still process them further to determine if they are truly bad or if they might go into my own personal mutant mix. The bag of coffee skins will probably end up as fertilizer for the spotty lawn in my backyard. After soaking for 24 to 36 hours, the mucilage layer will have deteriorated significantly due to the fermentation. Here I'll pour off some of the now sour-smelling water to a level just below that of the fruit. There will still often be a thin layer of mucilage remaining, so using my hands, I'll squeeze the slimy fruits against each other, allowing friction to help remove the last remnants of it. During this process, I'll periodically strain and rinse, continuing until the fruit reaches a point where I can feel their pebble-like texture against my skin, and they no longer slip between my fingers. They are now ready for drying. Before they go in their drying trays for 12 to 14 days, I lay the washed fruit out in front of a small fan to help eliminate any excess water. This also provides another opportunity for inspection. Now that the mucilage layer has been removed, any damage or insect invasion will be more apparent. There are very few insects that can get through the tough hull to the fruit inside, but the coffee berry borer is one of them. The beetles are endemic to South Africa and have found their way into every coffee-producing country except Nepal and Papua New Guinea. They were first noticed on the Big Island of Hawaii in 2010, but likely arrived there much sooner. They were discovered here on Oahu in 2014. The females bore into the coffee fruit and leave behind a distinct hole that is easily recognizable. I use a magnifying glass to assist, but the holes are visible to the naked eye. Fortunately, I have not seen a large amount of them in the trees that I harvest from, but it's likely only a matter of time. After about 8 days of drying in the trays, it's time to remove the hulls from the fruit. The fruit inside is now shrunk and taken on its more familiar bean-like appearance. By applying a little pressure to the hull, also known as the parchment layer due to its paper-like look and feel, the fruits can be easily removed. However, if you have a lot of coffee to be processed, this can be quite time-consuming and even a bit painful on your fingers. So I found an old blender, and after dulling the blades with the Dremel tool, was able to turn it into a nice parchment remover. After a few short spins in the processor, I check on the fruit. There will be a fine layer of parchment dust inside, so you want to remove the lid carefully. You can see a lot of the parchment has been separated. I can now pour this into a strainer and start sifting. The lighter parchment collects at the top and can be easily scooped away. If I had a strainer with larger holes, it'd be more ideal. This is just what I happen to have in the kitchen. Given the time, I'd probably modify the slots, making it easier for the parchment to pass through, but completely useless for spaghetti. Still, the blender puts me leaps and bounds ahead of doing it all by hand. After successfully separating the parchment layer from the dried fruits, I like to do my first moisture test. Green coffee needs to be stored and roasted with a moisture level between 11% and 13%. If the coffee is too wet, mold can grow on it, which will certainly affect the flavor and probably destroy the crop. If it is too dry, then it will get stale and also affect the flavor and the roasting process. Large commercial coffee producers often ship and store their green beans in 150-pound burlap sacks. The material allows for trapped moisture to work its way out and also allows the coffee to adapt to the climate of the room in which it's stored. Because of its propensity for absorption, green coffee is kept off the ground on wooden pallets away from the walls. Maintained in this way, green coffee beans can actually be stored for up to 12 months without any adverse effect to the quality. In contrast, after coffee is roasted, whole beans will begin to oxidize and break down in about 10 days and over time become bitter. Ground roasted coffee is considered good for even less time. The only way to get an accurate reading is with one of these moisture testers. This one by Agritronics runs around $250. When powered on, it reminds you to always average 3 tests. I filled the cap already with my beans. It is essential to run 3 tests, particularly if you are a large commercial grower. You want to test samples from different areas of your yield to verify that there aren't any large variations of moisture in your method of storage. Testing this sample gives me a moisture reading of 13.1%. I expected it to be around this level because the beans have only been drying for 8 days before I remove their parchment. Given another 5 to 7 days, I'll probably see their moisture levels fall to my preference of 12.2 to 12.5%. There are many different methods that can be used for home roasting coffee. Some people simply use a cast iron skillet and stir their beans over an open flame, which can be challenging to achieve an even roast. Another common method is to use certain models of popcorn poppers. These just need to be able to achieve temperatures above 400 degrees Fahrenheit and have strong enough fans to adequately circulate the beans, which are usually heavier than popcorn. One of the more sought-after popcorn poppers, highly prized among home roasters, is the 1980s model made by West Bend called the Poppery 2. They can occasionally be found on secondary markets for around $30 to $50, but the word is out and most people know that they are selling to home roasters. YouTube has many modification and improvement videos for these poppers. I used this $40 Pop Air unit quite successfully last year for my first roast, but this year I was gifted with a generous upgrade. The Fresh Roast SR800 dedicated coffee roaster. It takes a little skill to operate, but really allows you to dial in your roasts. When I was using a popcorn popper to roast, I developed a habit of preheating the unit until it was above 400 degrees Fahrenheit before adding my beans. I continue to preheat with the SR800 even though it wasn't mentioned in the sparse directions that came with it. So that's what I'm doing here. Once the unit reaches a preheat level of 420 degrees, I add my beans. Now this is a small batch roaster which can only handle about 8 ounces of beans at a time. In this video I'm roasting 4 ounces, which will end up weighing about 3 ounces once they are done. The unit settings allow me to control the fan speed and heat intensity. There's also a built-in timer, but I prefer to use a standalone. A quick turn of the dial and the settings will switch to the current temperature reading. Your preferred temperature will determine how you utilize the fan and heat controls during the roast. At some point in the roast, you will hear what is called the first crack. When this will occur depends on your roasting temperature. For me, this usually happens around the 4-minute mark. It sounds a bit like light popcorn popping. Fragrant steam will begin escaping from the beans, and at any point beyond this stage, the coffee is considered drinkable, although the taste will be very earthy if the roast is stopped right now. Color plays an important role in determining where you are in your roast. Close attention must be paid to the beans to achieve your desired roast and to avoid over or under roasting them. It is a skill that evolves from trial and error. The SR800 has a cool-down function that, when activated, turns the heat off but continues running the fan for 3 minutes. Roasting coffee beans will continue to roast internally even after they are removed from heat, so cooling them down immediately is essential to locking in the desired flavor of your roast. During the entire roasting process, a thin layer of silver skin, or what's called the chaff, has been blowing off the beans and collecting in the roasting lid filter. Care should be used when removing the lid to avoid making a mess or more work for yourself later. The lid is also extremely hot, thus why I'm wearing the glove. Another carryover from my popcorn popper roasting days was the method of cooling my beans by stirring them inside a larger pot full of cold water. This works great, but you have to be careful not to splash any water onto your fresh roast. I continue to do this despite the SR800's cool-down mode because I find that the roasted beans are still quite warm after the cool-down is completed. Another common practice is to pour the beans back and forth between a metal colander. This not only helps with the cooling, but it also helps to remove some of the stubborn chaff that's often still remaining on the beans. There will always be some chaff tucked away in the center of the beans. It doesn't affect the flavor, but removing as much as possible just makes for a cleaner grind. After the coffee has been cooled to room temperature, it will go into a valve bag for at least 24 hours before it is brewed. This is because fresh roasted coffee needs to degas, a releasing of CO2 before it will take on the full desired flavor of the roast. While it is drinkable immediately after the roast, the best flavor and aroma is achieved after it has degassed. Some types of coffee are actually considered best from 2 and even 5 days after roasting. The one-way valve on the coffee bag allows the CO2 to escape, but stops oxygen and humidity from entering. The roasted coffee will never completely stop breaking down, and after about 10 days, it will often start to appear oily and develop a bitter taste, which is why it should be consumed within that period of time. As I mentioned earlier, green coffee beans can be stored for a year or even longer with proper storage technique. And even though most coffee connoisseurs agree that roasted coffee beans begin to lose their best characteristics after 10 days, the internet is full of conflicting expiration dates for roasted coffee, even disagreeing on whether it's a good or bad idea to store coffee in the refrigerator or freezer. I personally think, because of coffee's absorbing characteristics, that it is a bad idea, unless perhaps it is sealed really well. Most people do not want pot roast or onion-infused coffee, but to each their own. I personally prefer a cool, dry, dark place, stored in a valve bag or a well-sealed container. Remember that each time you open a coffee bag or container, you're letting in oxygen and humidity, which only accelerates the breakdown and therefore the flavor. Harvesting and roasting my own coffee has led to a much greater appreciation of this amazing fruit that has been so integral to our lives and our productivity since at least the 15th century. I have a better understanding of the value of a cup of coffee now that I know just how much work goes into making it. That 10 pounds of fresh-picked coffee cherries only equals 2 pounds of dried green coffee beans and about 1 pound 10 ounces of roasted coffee. It underscores the need and purpose of having fair trade standards in order to encourage sustainable environmental farming practices and to discourage the exploitation of forced and child labor. I've been able to develop and explore my own coffee tasting palate now that I am fully capable of controlling my own roast. And after decades of drinking coffee with way too much creamer and early on sugar, I now only drink it black because it tastes so much better than the bitter cup that I'd grown used to. I will admit that roasting my own coffee has turned me into a bit of a coffee snob and perhaps made me insufferable around the crafty table at work, but only so that you might see. I hope that you found this video insightful and perhaps are inspired to try roasting your own beans sometime. Fortunately, you do not have to have coffee growing in your backyard to do so. There are several companies now serving a growing community of home roasters with a great variety of inexpensive green coffee beans from around the world, and lots of resources available to help you along the way. However, it is great to just experiment and explore on your own. There's nothing better than the smell of freshly roasted ground coffee going into a French press, except for the amazing taste of what comes out 6 or 7 minutes later. Enjoy.